So the structure of the lecture of today is that I'll go through some definitions and then take some time to talk about the different parts of welfare assessment or types of welfare indicators that there are. So this is essentially built up on the idea of the 5 domains model, which is very popular nowadays. But it's also the same structure that Welfare Quality has used, a big EU project that focuses on animal welfare and animal welfare indicators. So let me start with the basics. There are 3 different types of welfare indicators. There are resource-based indicators, management-based indicators, and animal-based indicators. Now, resource-based indicators are indicators which are input indicators. So there are things which affect the animal. It could be things like stocking density, provision of food, access to outdoors, etc. So that's resource-based indicators. Then there are management-based indicators. Management-based indicators are indicators in which the management is determining something or doing something with animals. So, for example, bringing sick animals into sick pen. That's a management-based indicator. Tail docking, teeth clipping. These are all management-based indicators. Now, there's no doubt that both resource-based indicators and management-based indicators are very, very important for animal welfare. The problem is that the relationship between animal welfare and the indicators is dependent on many other things. If you've been out on a farm, I'm sure you know that you can visit one farm, Farm A, and it has a certain stocking density, certain number of drinkers, length of feed trough, etc. And it has excellent welfare for its animals. You can go out to Farm B that has the same stocking density, the same feed trough, etc., but has very bad animal welfare. So there's something else. There's something apart from the resource-based indicators that affects the animal welfare. And therefore, people have started focusing much, much more on animal-based indicators. So animal-based indicators are all indicators which are measured on the animal. So, for example, number of scratches, tail biting, body condition, but also behavior, aggression, for example. These are all animal-based indicators. And the animal-based indicators are thought to be more valid indicators of animal welfare. They lie closer to the experiences of the animal, which seems reasonable to assume. The problem is that resource-based indicators can be seen as being very objective. So number of animals per pen. We can all agree there are 18 pigs in this pen. We can count them, no problem. Or we can say, all right, so there are 2 drinkers in the pen. 1, 2, no problem. That makes it easy to formulate legislation around resource-based indicators. When it comes to animal-based indicators, it's much harder. And it's harder for the evaluator, assessor of the welfare, but it's also harder for the farmer. If you say, according to legislation, you're not allowed to have more than 10% pigs with tail bites, the inspector comes out to the farm and sees here's 12% tail-beaten pigs. And the farmer says, well, I've done everything I can do. I provided rooting material, I have a low stocking density, they're excellent feed, excellent water. What can I do more? It's very hard for a farmer to do anything specifically about the animal-based indicators. Because some things, like tail biting, for example, can suddenly explode, and it's very hard to predict. That's why if we look at different assessment protocols, some protocols, like the welfare quality and the QBTL, concentrate on animal-based indicators. They do have some input indicators, but mainly animal-based indicators. Whereas others, like TGI or Speciae from the UK and Better Leven from the Netherlands, they all use input indicators, resource-based indicators, because that's simply easier to control. We'll get back to the integrated value and absolute requirement, these two columns, at my next lecture in 3 weeks' time, when I'm talking about aggregation of welfare indicators. So what about indicators? What should they be, so to speak? Well, they should be valid, obviously, welfare relevant. So say, is lameness related to pain? If lameness is just the animal is limping, but it doesn't feel any pain, is it then welfare relevant? Or dirt? Has a dirty pig bad welfare? Well, perhaps. Perhaps not. You can discuss that. And that is the first part of it. The second part of it is that once you have decided on an indicator, you should decide on how to measure that indicator. And these measures need to be repeatable, they need to be feasible, and well correlated to the indicator, obviously. So in some instances, this is very obvious. So if you are measuring lameness by looking at whether the pig is using all its 4 feet, that's probably a very good measure of lameness. But you could imagine that saying, well, I don't have time to go around and checking each pig. I want to install a system, like a video system, that records the movement of pigs. Let's see how much they move. And if there's a low level of activity, I assume that correlates to lameness. But that's not obvious. So you need both a valid indicator and you need a measure that is a valid measure for the indicator. So there are 2 steps to this. So if I start with feed and water. Now, body condition score is something which is very often used as a measure of hunger. Primarily, of course, long-term hunger. The problem with using body condition are 2. So first of all, the level of hunger experienced by the animal is not directly related to the body condition. So if you give sows, it's most often a problem in the gestation section where you feed restrict the sows. If you measure the body condition of the sows, you may have 2 farms, one with roughage and one without roughage, but they both have the same level of body condition. but the ones with roughage are going to be experiencing less hunger, simply because roughage lets the animal to perform a natural type of foraging behavior. The second problem with body condition scores is that there's a poor repeatability with human observers. So we can probably agree that this pig here is very thin. But as soon as you get into less clear examples, there's a poor repeatability. Now, it may be that in the future we'll be able to just use video or AI for registering body condition score that seems at present to yield much better inter-observer reliability. But as I said, I mean, this is something for the future and certainly not installed in most pig farms today. So, access to roughage. As I said, access to roughage seems to diminish some parts of the hunger level in sows. So you get less stereotypic behavior, less abnormal behavior if they're given access to roughage. You have a more normal feeding pattern. And one additional advantage is that it actually decreases the risk of gastric ulcers. Doesn't have anything to do with hunger, of course, but gastric ulcers is one of the major issues in sow welfare. However, even if you give them roughage, they are still hungry. The only way to alleviate hunger is to give them as much food as they want. The issue is, of course, that if you do that, they will grow very fat and they will have problems around farrowing, and there's a risk of both piglet mortality and sow mortality. So you need to keep them thin for their own sake, so to speak, but that also means that they are going to be hungry. Another issue with hunger, or problem associated with hunger, is weaning age. So weaning age is a very relevant measure. Because the problem is, of course, that the intestine is not ready for solid food until around 6 weeks, 7 weeks. But we are currently weaning in the EU at 28 or 21 days of age. Another issue with weaning age is that it's quite difficult to check. If you come out into a farrowing section, they will probably say, all right, so this sow farrowed at this point in time. But in many cases, they will use nursery sows. So you will move piglets from one sow to another. And when they're moved, it's not noted. So the actual weaning age is quite difficult to get from the farmer. And of course, extremely difficult for you to check. What about water provision? Well, it's an easy resource-based measure, number of working drinkers. The issue here is not whether it's whether it's difficult to check. The issue is that we don't really know how many drinkers are necessary. So if you look at the RSPCA from the UK, their recommendation, it's 10 pigs per drinker. For welfare quality, it's also 10 pigs per drinker. But if you try to look at the scientific literature, there's actually nothing that supports this. So we don't really know how many drinkers are needed per pig, or how many pigs can go for one drinker, so to speak. There's been some discussion about the type of drinker provided. So in general, animals, and not just pigs, prefer drinking from open bowls like the one here at the top. They prefer that over nipples like the one you see the pig drinking from here. But the problem with the open drinkers is that they very rapidly become dirty. And if they're dirty, the water is dirty, and pigs prefer to drink clean water, as do we all. So there are two different preferences going against each other here. And there's no clear winner in this case. So just to summarize then, we look at body condition scores that are important for, especially important for sows, to some extent for pigs. They are not extremely relevant. Reproducibility of the results is poor. But of course, it's very easy to do. Just go out and look at the pigs and register. Roughage, it's very important for sows, not that important for pigs. Reproducibility is okay, because you need to define what type of roughage we're speaking about, access to it, etc. Practicality, well, just go out and look for it. Weaning age, it's relevant. High reproducibility, very practical measure. Number of functioning drinkers, poor relevance. Type of drinkers, poor relevance, but of course it's easy to observe. And water quality, that's important. It's very hard to assess. It's a practical measure in the sense that it's easier to go out and look at the water. But you will not agree on what is dirty water and what is not dirty water. That's a difficult one. Unless it's in the extreme cases, of course. So do you have any questions concerning feed and water provision? Or indicators for feed and water?
No, so far.
No. All right. Then moving on to environment. So one obvious input measure is the stocking density. Prevention of natural behavior. If you have high stocking density, pigs aren't, well, they can't move around as much as they would like, of course. Very little possibility to play, an increased risk of competition, depending on other resources available, of course. But it also means that if you have a solid floor area in your pen, not very many, or not a large proportion of the pigs will actually be able to lie down on the solid floor. They will be forced to lie down on the slatted floor, which in general is not good for them. Slatted floors is another input measure, proportion of slatted floors. So in this case, a little bit hard to see, but 1/3 of the pen is actually solid floor, and 2/3 is slatted. The problem with slatted floors is that it affects the knee joints of the pigs. There's correlation with bursitis. But slatted floor is also, in general, not always, but in general, more slippery than solid floor. And because it's more slippery, it makes it harder for pigs to fight. When I say it makes it harder for them to fight, I don't mean that they fight less, rather the reverse. Because it's harder to fight, it's harder to determine who is winning the fight. They will continue fighting for longer. So poor floor quality actually increases fighting bout length, which of course you don't want. In the farrowing unit, you typically have sows farrowing alone. You can either have loose-housed sows or crated sows. In Denmark, almost all sows are crated, more than 90%. So they're locked into this farrowing unit, into this crate, approximately 1 week before expected farrowing. And they stay there until the weaning of the piglets, so for approximately 1 month, or 1 month and a half. If they are in the crate, they can of course not build a nest. And this is something sows are very motivated to do before, just before farrowing. Another issue with crated sows is that the sow is supposed to lie on its left side here, because there's quite a lot of space to your right. So it would be easy for the piglets to nurse from this side. But the sow has turned the wrong way around, so to speak, which means that there's very little distance between the teats of the sow and the wall. And this is, of course, because the farrowing pen is quite small, typically around 4.5 square meters. Building it bigger would cost money, but it will also increase the likelihood of the piglets being able to nurse more efficiently. If you have crated sows and the pen is too small, then you risk having a higher piglet mortality or a higher piglet growth, and of course, animals experiencing hunger here. If you have a loose-housed farrowing system, you need a fairly large pen, so around 6.5 square meters. If you have 6.5 square meters, the piglet mortality is fairly low, comparable to crated sows. If you have smaller pens than that, loose-housed farrowing risks inducing higher piglet mortality. I'll get back to mortality in a moment. Another cause of mortality in newborn piglets is shivering. I know these aren't newborn, but you can see it anyway here. The animals are shivering, the animals are lying up against each other, especially newborn piglets are quite susceptible to the cold. And if they're cold, they're less likely to seek out the teats. And if they don't seek out the teats during the first 24 hours, there's a high risk of them dying. Another issue with temperature is, of course, overheating. And this is primarily a problem for sows and to some extent pigs during transport. And the way to detect this is panting. It has a good repeatability if you are watching the pigs at the same time. So if you and I are watching the pigs, no problem about repeatability. If I look at the pigs and you then come 6 hours later and look at the same pigs, then repeatability is poor. something that is very often mentioned is air quality. Of course, if you come into a pig unit, you can feel the stickiness of ammonia, for example, in your nose. So you could imagine that it's easy to assess air quality. The problem is, of course, that the pigs don't breathe the air at the same location that you do. To actually be able to assess the air quality in a good manner, you would need a sensor that is in the pig sty, in the pig pen. And we all know what pigs do with material. They tend to destroy it. So it's actually quite difficult to measure at pig level. Once again, the extremes are not a problem, but to get a good feel for intermediate levels of ammonia is not that easy to do. According to EU legislation, pigs should have access to enrichment material, which should be destructible, deformable, etc. And the examples given by the Commission are things like straw, sphagnum, etc. The problem is that straw, sphagnum, etc. are things that are hard to get rid of from the pigsty. You look at the slats here in the picture at the bottom. If you have too much straw, there's a risk that these slats are going to be filled with straw, and all the manure won't be able to come out. So what people have started trying to do, inventing, are things like this pig right, where pigs chew on these plastic straws, or in Denmark, very popular, using a piece of wood standing in the pigsty, in the pig pen. The idea is that this type of enrichment will increase the rooting behavior of the pigs. The problem is, of course, that if you use a bite right, they don't root, they just chew. So ideally, you should be using straw, like recommended by the European Union, like in this picture here. But in practice, very few countries actually require straw to be used. Sweden does, Finland does, Norway does, Switzerland does, but that's about it. In most other countries, other materials are allowed. Excuse me for just a minute. Sorry. If you want to look closer at what pigs actually prefer, there's a very good paper by Mette Studnitz and co-authors from 2007, in which they try to look at different studies comparing different rooting materials. And the circles here are materials for which the preference is not significantly different. So peat, mushroom compost, and sawdust are actually equally preferred in this study here. But as you can see, things like peat, branches, compost, wood shavings, compost, are all things which are highly ranked for the pigs. This is something they really like. Not least beetroots, maize, silage, carrots on a string, etc. as well, of course. Whereas chopped straw comes much lower down. Straw from a dispenser, and this is important, I'll get back to this, comes further down. Sand, beam, metal chain, or even concrete, which has been tried out. Are extremely low down on that preference. I can really recommend this paper. So, trying to assess what enrichment material is given to the pigs, that's obviously a fairly easy task. You just go into the pen and observe. One measure that is quite common, but also something people have discussed the relevance of, is the amount of manure on the pigs. In most cases, pigs will avoid lying down in manure. So in most cases, pigs attempt to be clean. But there are two instances where you can see a lot of manure on the pigs. One is when it's too hot. Because when it's too hot, the pigs will prefer lying on the slats where it's colder or cooler, rather than lying in the designated lying area. So they will dung on the slats and then lie there. And the second case, of course, is when the animals have diarrhea, where you find manure everywhere. One measure of animal welfare, which is incredibly important for the public, perhaps less so for the scientists working in animal welfare, is outdoor access. So this kind of idyllic picture that you can see here, I mean, that's typically something which is used to sell pig meat. In reality, extremely few pigs are kept like this. In Denmark, less than 1%. This picture was actually taken from a specialty meat farm in southern Sweden, the only one of its kind. Outdoor access has quite a lot of welfare problems, but does have the advantage of it of course gives the animals possibility to perform many more natural behaviors. It has lower stocking density, so a number of advantages to it as well, but also increases parasitic load, for example, in the pigs. Increased risk of diseases. It's much more probable that these animals are going to be sick than the ones kept indoors under in a restricted environment. So if we go to the environment, you can see that things like stocking density and flooring are highly relevant, welfare relevant, easy to reproduce, higher reproducibility into observer repeatability, and very practical measures. Access to enrichment material, likewise. These are the ones that are most highly recommended, I would say. This is not to say that, for example, crating is not important. It certainly is, as is thermal comfort and air quality. But they are more difficult to observe and so less practical. Do you have any questions about the environment? No, I don't hear anything. Moving on to health and pain. So lameness has a high repeatability between observers, but low repeatability over time. So if we to look at the same, oops, I'm sorry, I thought I had a, just a moment. I had a video. Just seems to have lost. Okay, I'll try to find that one in the break. Back to sharing the presentation. All right, so the reason for why it has a low repeatability over time is that the lameness shown by the sows is, for example, dependent on the surface they are walking on. It's also dependent on how long they have stood up. So if you find a sow lying down and you kind of shove it a bit to get it to rise up, it will seem to be lame during the first 5-10 minutes. But perhaps will walk normally after that. So there are lots of other factors affecting the level of lameness shown by the animals. But if we are looking at the animal at the same time, we will agree that, yes, this is a lame sow and this is not a lame sow, etc. So if you're going to use lameness as a measure, it's important to standardize the way that the animals are, the conditions under which the animals are observed. So say, I will only study animals that have stood up for 5 minutes. I will also always let them walk in the same part of the pen or in the deep straw or what have you. But it needs to be comparable. Another issue with health and pain is wounds on the body. Of course, these in almost all cases caused by aggression. There are really two types of aggression. It's at mixing, where you see typically wounds around in the head and neck region. And that can be quite fierce just when mixing the pigs. So if you come out onto a farm where they've just mixed the sows, you're going to find quite a lot of wounds. And if you come back a week later, very little. The second type of aggression is bullying, in which one pig either continuously tries to bite one other individual, or you have competition around feeding. So if you see wounds in the back region of a sow, that in one sense is much more serious than the wounds in the head and neck region, because in the head and neck region, that will pass over time, whereas in the back region, it will not, or it's less likely to do it. One way of preventing this bullying and preventing vulvar lesions that are also caused by aggression around feeding is using this type of feeding system where you have one feeding system per, one feeder per sow. So what happens is that you open these, it's hard to see here, but you can open these. So they're kept open during most of the day. But just when you start feeding the sows, you lock them behind the sows. And the sows can't come out until all feed has been eaten. And this is a very good way of preventing vulvar lesions and aggression around feeding in the gestation unit. Health and pain, mortality is an obvious example. It's surprisingly difficult to measure. One of the reasons for that is that there are differing definitions of mortality in piglets. So some will call all dead piglets, I have that number as a number for mortality. So even piglets that are stillborn will count as mortality. Others will say, no, it's only live-born piglets, mortality of live-born piglets. Then finally, others will say, no, it's only piglets 1 day after birth that die at least 1 day after birth that are counted. So when you try to compare mortality between different articles or different systems, you need to be very observant on what is actually meant by mortality. An additional problem in animal welfare respect is that you can have a low mortality because you don't kill even animals that should have been killed. I mean, you can increase the overall welfare on a farm by killing animals that are severely lame, have huge abscesses, huge vulvar lesions, serious prolapse, etc., etc. But in that case, you will be punished because you have a high mortality. Or you can have a low mortality but bad welfare by not culling these animals. So in that sense, mortality should be treated with respect and with care, interpreted with care. Respiratory problems, especially in pigs and sows, is probably a better measure of air quality than ammonia level, simply because it is a measure on the actual animal. You can detect lung lesions at slaughter. Of course, this means it's very late in the process. You can use written video AI recordings, probably more accurate to say just AI recordings, because coughing in pigs is related to respiratory problems and can be detected by microphones and analyzed using the AI. That's actually part of an aWISH project at present. Prolapse is undoubtedly a serious problem when it occurs, but it's not very, very frequent. It's a cause of sow culling in about 1 to 2% of cases. And these are data from Denmark and the Netherlands. So few sows, but it's undoubtedly a bad thing when it happens. One major disease in pigs is diarrhea, enteric problems. Sorry. And this is most often most often occurs around weaning. So weaning diarrhea is a phenomenon by itself. Going from milk to solid food and being at the same time being removed from the sow, from the mother, and being mixed with others really is a recipe for weaning diarrhea. And it's fairly easy to see. You can see here, so these piglets aren't weaned yet, but they're still having diarrhea. You see it on the pigs, you see it on the walls of the pen. And there are a number of other diseases, of course, such as mastitis, metritis, hernias, etc. And also attempts at measuring pain directly on pigs. So something which has become increasingly popular is something called a pain phase. So in many species, rats, rabbits, mice, horses, cattle, cats, monkeys, researchers have identified something called a pain phase. It's a specific contraction of muscles, which is specific to the feeling of pain. In pigs, the validation is not clear-cut. There are some studies that suggest that there is a pain phase, but it's something which is quite hard to observe in pigs. I mean, they don't have as many facial expressions as does, for example, a horse. Any questions about health? If not, I suggest we take a 10-minute break. I've been talking during 45 minutes, I think. So break, having some coffee, if you have that, around where you are. Stretching the legs and getting some fresh air, I think would be a good idea.
Okay, then we're going to continue in 10 minutes, yeah?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes. The question is until when, Bjorn? You are going to present?
Yes.
Another quarter or regarding the timing, just?
I think you said it was an hour and a half.
Exactly, until, yeah. Then another 15 minutes, I think, or 20 minutes.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, okay, great. Let's start.
Okay.
Thank
Good.
you.
So obviously, there are a number of things that we do with our animals that cause pain. Nose ringing in sows, for example, so they don't tear up the grass if we keep them outdoors. Tail docking, very frequent to prevent castration. Tail docking to prevent tail biting in pigs. And tail teeth clipping or grinding in piglets as well. When it comes to behaviors, we have very few positive behaviors in pigs. In In many other animals, you have things like mutual grooming. What we do have in pigs is some kind of nose-nose contact, and obviously pigs like to lie together in close proximity. But that's about it when it comes to affiliative behaviors. For aggression, we do have a lot, as I said before. The problem with using aggression as a measure is that it's very hard to observe. It's much easier to observe the effects of aggression, so look for the wounds instead. You find aggression especially around mixing, of course, as said previously, but also depending on the feed provision system. So the other system I showed you with 1 box per sow works very well, low amount of aggression. This system here is almost designed to cause aggression. There's 1 sow here standing feeding, and the sows around her will try to move her away to get access to the feeder. This is an extremely poor system. If you're using electron sow feeding, it should be a system where the sow enters and no other sow can get at her, so she's fully protected while feeding. An important behavior for sows is nest building. It's difficult to check whether sows have access to nest building material, both because they only need it shortly before farrowing. So farmer can always say, well, she's not going to farrow yet. And also because the way of provisioning the material plays an important role. So if you give her nest building material on the ground, she will use it. If you give it in a straw provider, she will use much less. It seems that she doesn't regard it as being nest building material unless it's lying on the floor. So that needs to be checked. I'll just skip over this one. And this is, you can see the effect of giving nest building material and not giving nest building material. So in the dotted line is these are sows that have no nest building material, and the solid lines, the sow has nest building material. As you can see, they spend many more hours nest building if they have access to nest building material, but they try to build a nest with any material that is present. Nodding is much higher for the sows with access to nest building material, whereas stereotypies is quite frequent amongst sows that have no nest building material. So access to nest building material is actually quite an important input for an animal welfare assessment, even though it is difficult to check. Fear of humans is another one. It's very easy to do a proper test. Human approach test, you simply enter the pen and see whether the sow or the pig comes towards you and how long it takes. Level of fear of humans has a strong effect on reproductive performance of the sows, with fearful sows giving birth to less piglets and higher risk of crashing. This is probably because if the sow is very fearful, she will tend to react strongly when you enter the stable. And each time she stands up and then lies down again, increases the risk of crushing of the piglets. Moving on to general indicators. One indicator is tail and ear lesions. So I'm talking about tail biting. Now, tail biting can be quite hard to see, and tail lesions, especially if it's a large pen with, say, 30, 35 piglets, is quite hard to determine. What you can do is to look for tail down behavior. So if more pigs have their tails down, it actually means that there's something wrong in the pen. Either the piglets are sick or there's going to be a tail biting outbreak. Risk factors for tail biting are lack of rooting material and having a short feeding trough. But you can also get it if you have general stresses like draft, change of feed, any disturbances really. Automatic recording systems are being developed to try to assess whether there is going to be a tail biting outbreak, but they are not yet commercially available as far as I know. This is just an example of a study in which they compared a control pen and a pen with tail biting outbreak. So 3 days before, you can see there's an increase in number of tails tucked between the legs. The day before, it's twice as many in the pen with the tail biting out, with the coming tail biting outbreak. And it's enough to stand there for a minute to see whether the tails are up and down and give a proper assessment of this. One indicator, which I mentioned briefly, was stereotypies. This is most common in the gestation section caused by increased hunger, but you can also see it in farrowing stores in some cases. It may be difficult to see the stereotypy by itself because pigs often stop when you enter the stable. But what you can see is this frothy saliva, which is a sign that the sows have been stereotyping before you came in. An exciting new indicator that's being developed and tested in the aWISH project is tear staining. So this is what you can see on these pigs, the dark brown area around the eyes. It has been shown to be related to stress, but it's also related to age. And in the aWISH project, we are currently attempting to find a good automatic recording of this, for it to be a good indicator that can be used. The same type of scheme as before, tail and ear lesions, because it's affected by so many different things, is probably a good general indicator, as is level of stereotypic behavior. Finally, to end up talking about positive welfare, that is all people are talking about nowadays. One such indicator is play. It's intuitive. Piglets show social and non-social play, but it can be quite hard to distinguish from fighting. So if you look at this film here, and if I were to ask you, all right, so are these playing or are they fighting? Or perhaps both, and if so, when? Does it go from one to the other?
What do you think? Fighting.
There are some other possibilities, some candidates like tail wagging in pigs. People have tried to suggest that this may be an indicator of positive welfare. They do show an increase in positive situations, but it's a relatively new indicator, and as far as I know, it hasn't been included in any of the animal welfare schemes. So we don't have a lot of good positive welfare indicators in pigs yet. Hopefully they're coming. The final indicator I will talk about is one indicator of possible overall animal welfare, something called a qualitative behavior assessment, in which the farmer or the observer is asked to evaluate the animal based on a number of descriptors. So the question is, how aggressive is the pig? How friendly is it? How listless? How depressed? How joyful? How etc. This method has been criticized for being subjective, but it does show good inter-observer reliability. So people observing the same animal tend to agree to a very high extent. And the advantage is that it captures both positive and negative situations. And it's also a very fast method of evaluating animal welfare. And it's quite popular. We have just written a review where we have compared 200 different articles using QBA in different species. So it is a method that is out there and is being used. But it is a bit controversial. I'll get back to this one during the aggregation lecture. So now I have talked a lot about different measures, different indicators. Let me just finish and saying, all right, so if you were to use as few indicators as possible, just as few as possible to capture animal welfare when you get into the stable, which indicators would you use? Then for my part, I think I would use mortality, despite it being difficult to interpret. Roughage, access to roughage, because it's such an important part for gestating sows. Tail biting, because it's such a general, it's affected by so many different things. It's actually quite a good indicator of animal welfare. And finally, the QBA system. These are 4 indicators I would be choosing.